Hi, I'm Danielle McDaniel, the Clay Lady, and welcome to the Clay Lady Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. Today I want to show you some of the techniques and tools that we use in the hand building lesson in my classes. When you're working at the potter's wheel, your pot is automatically smooth, the thickness is just right, and when you're hand building, these are the things that we need to make sure happen. One thing, when we're rolling out our slab, either with a rolling pin or a slab roller, we want to make sure that it's thick as an Oreo cookie. That's a Clay Lady rule, not a double stuff, not one you twist in half, but about 1/4 of an inch. You also want to make sure the edges are nice and smooth. One way that we hide whether our slab is smooth or not is with texture. So I teach a lot of texture on some of our projects. I'm getting ready to show you one of the most favorite projects of my students, and that's a Poof Pot. You get a slab of clay. I'm going to use texture for the middle. I'm going to put the slab on this piece of nice foam, and then this is just a wooden board with a handle. I put this right in the middle and I poof, and it's automatically a nice form for you to use as a dish. Here's another Poof Pot. You can tell it was made using this form. Now the basic two forms in hand building are hump molds and slump molds. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. First, we're going to talk about a hump mold. This hump mold was made out of plaster. I just had a bowl, filled it with plaster, waited for it to harden, and now I have a mold. Now the plaster works like canvas on a table. It'll suck the water from the clay and let the clay go. I can take this slab that I've already pre-cut and I lay this on here, and now I have a dish. Now if I flip it over right now, it might go flat. And so we want to make sure that we let it dry on this mold for at least an hour or so. We can't let this dry too long because when clay dries it shrinks, and if this is too tight around this mold it will crack. Now that's the disadvantage to a hump mold, but the advantage is while I've made it I can also add to the outside. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and add a foot to this. Now the way that we attach clay in the studio is we use a toothbrush and water. We're going to scratch the surface with that toothbrush, get a good slurry up, mixing that clay and that water together, and then I can lay this on here. Since I have this on a banding wheel, I can use a sponge and spin this around to help get this nice and smooth. So that's the advantage to a hump mold, in that you can decorate the outside of it. Now let's talk about a slump mold. That's when the clay slab goes in the clay and slumps. This is a plastic bowl. It's not plaster. It doesn't have canvas on it. So if I put clay directly on a plastic bowl or styrofoam or glass or metal, the clay just will suction to the piece. It won't release. So we have to have a release. We use two releases in the studio. One is a cooking spray. You just spray it just in the middle and smear it around, and that will let the clay release. You can also use baby powder, same thing. Put it in there like flour on a pan, and you can just put the baby powder on there and that will help it release. Not both of them, one or the other. Another way that you can do a release is using fabric. So I have this slab, I can lay this fabric, I can roll with a rolling pin and really push that fabric in there, again making texture, and then I can use this in my slump mold, push this in, and I can let this dry. And the advantage to a slump mold is when it dries, clay shrinks. So we can leave it in this mold until I'm ready to pull it out, clean it up, write my name on it, because as it dries it'll pull in. Let me show you what the texture will look like with this. Once this comes out, we pull that off, and so the outside of your bowl would have that beautiful texture. This is a nice example of a slump mold. I can tell it's a slump mold because of this addition on the top. If it had been a hump mold built over like this, they would not have been able to do this. So they had this form, they put the clay in, did a really good job of smoothing, and then you can see where they added this on top. The advantage to the slump mold, again, is that it would be able to dry in that mold until you were able to pull it out easily. So you can also do forms that don't involve a hump or a slump. We have this as a plastic leaf. Of course, you could use a real leaf. We can lay this on the slab, roll this in, use a tool to cut around the edge. You would clean that edge up with a damp sponge. You don't want to use a really wet sponge because that'll actually rub the clay away and leave it rough, just leave the grog. So just a damp sponge around the edges. I pull this off, and so then I have this form. But instead of it being flat, I could spray a little Pam in here, put a little baby powder in here, maybe just a piece of fabric, and then I could lay this in here so it would dry and have a little bit of shape. So this is an example of what that looks like after it's been fired. There are other ways of making a slump mold. This is a box that has fabric stapled around the edges. Makes it really nice. You don't have to worry about finding your fabric or using baby powder or the Pam. Here's another example of that. This is just a board with a picture frame, and then you can see the indentation where they put the picture frame on there, and then they put the fabric around, put a slab on here so you can tap it on the table, and so you can make a nice slump mold. This is a nice example of that. This is a good slump mold, and you can tell it's a slump mold because of the handles on the side. Good craftsmanship on this. The texture really pulls your eyes away from if it is bumpy or smooth. The edges are nice and rounded. It's a really nice example of how simple but how elegant a hand-built piece can be. We also have sprig molds. This is a manufactured sprig mold, and you can get all different kinds of designs, but you can also make your own, just like I made my own hump mold with the plaster. You can make plaster and put pieces of jewelry or found objects in the plaster. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take this piece of clay and I'm going to push it in, and then because this is plaster, the clay just lets go. And I can let this go, and then I could trim this out, and I could use the toothbrush and water and scratch and put this on different of my pieces to add some embellishment. So the last thing I'm going to show you is a cylinder, and we have a slab of clay texture. I'm going to roll the texture on the slab of clay. And then you can use any cylinder, and what I did is I taped telephone book paper not to the cylinder but to itself, because you can see it works like a sleeve. So once I wrap this around the cylinder, and I can use that toothbrush to scratch right here to make it adhere, or if I wanted to, I can use a paddle to make it adhere this direction. Just make sure that it's got a good and attached. And then for the bottom, I can have a slab of clay. Put this, I can cut this exactly and use the toothbrush to really scratch that up and get a good slip so that they stick. But another way to do this, since we're not really going for perfect even lines and perfection, we can pull this up around the edge, and then again you can use this paddle. Now this paddle has texture on one side, is smooth on the other, and we can paddle that around the edge. And then after it has a chance to stiffen just a little bit, because again, when clay dries, it shrinks. So we don't want to leave this on here for a long period of time, maybe just about an hour where the slab can get a little stiff. And then I can just slide this out because of the telephone book paper sleeve on the inside. Here's a nice example of one of my students and how they did a good job of making some texture on the side. Nice glaze job too. And then I like this around the top. It just gives it a little bit of interest, embellishment. So in summary, hand-built pottery is pretty easy, but it does take craftsmanship, just like being on the potter's wheel. You need to make sure the edges are smooth, it's a good thickness, make sure that you have points of interest, whether that's the texture or an embellishment, but have fun in the hand-building studio.